Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. And what we're going to tackle today is Canadian infantry from the Second World War, which, well, he might look a little familiar here because he's wearing a uniform almost identical to that of the British troops that were deployed in the same period. So how is that going to be any different? Well, luckily, it's a matter of just painting them differently, which is nice and simple. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the color selection, but as I will mention, there are timestamps so you can jump around as you need to. All of the paints will be listed in the description below, so nice and quick, let's get started.
Now, first of all, we need to talk about colors. If you want to go straight to the painting, you can skip this section. There's timestamps down the bottom there, but I figure it's probably worth going over some of this if you're either new to the subject or you just want to be sure that you're doing things quote-unquote correctly. Now, I've got 3 paints in front of me here, and theoretically, any of them is a suitable one for our Canadian infantry. So, as always, there's a little bit of explanation required. Now, with wargaming, I tend to find there's a lot of inertial wisdom, old ideas that are a little bit hard to shift. And sometimes things like colors or weapons that were available is one of those things. So, the Canadian battle dress, was it really green? Well, I've got a few photos. I've done some reading, some research, and looked at the Canadian Military Museum as well. And if we have a look at this photo here, and this one popping up on the right, you'll see, yeah, even if we account for 80 years of fade, these preserved uniforms, they're very clearly green. They aren't greenish-brown, they are brownish-green. And that's what we're going to have to settle for here. So, if you hold up a color swatch of VALLEJO colors alongside these uniforms, what you'll get is essentially the answer Russian uniform, World War II. Now, if you take something which is the correct color on a full-size version and you just use that to paint the miniature, it's going to look super dark. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to the painting side of things, but to be honest, Russian uniform is going to be probably your best starting point for Canadian battle dress. Now, depending on where they were deployed, some Canadian troops were going to be resupplied with British kit. Now, English uniform, you've seen me paint British and Dominion infantry before. This would be perfectly acceptable. There's not a wrong answer between Canadian green and English brownish sort of khaki color. But on the end here, US field drab. Well, there was also a huge swathe of war-manufactured stuff for the British by the Americans, and they got the designs for the British battle dress and produced a huge amount of additional uniforms for British troops. Now, that wasn't in the English uniform, it wasn't in that sort of khaki, greenish tinted brown, it was US field drab. That was the wool that they had available, so that's what they used. Now, in some instances, this is a little more rare, but it is also feasible you'd have Canadian troops resupplied from British stocks that had been filled with American war support materials. So, any one of these 3 could theoretically be the correct color for your Canadians. Something to bear in mind. Since I've already painted a couple using these 2 different paints, what we'll do today is the, let's say, correct version, and we're going to paint using Russian uniform. So I've got here one of the plastic infantry from Warlord Games. This is from the British and Canadian infantry box. And you'll notice as well I've clipped off the little pig sticker bayonet on the rifles. I don't tend to like having them on my plastic stuff. They catch on a lot of things and the foam that I store them in, but it doesn't matter too much one way or the other. Now you'll see straight away he's not primed, and that's because, well, today it is minus 10 degrees Celsius outside. And while there are some clever little tricks for gently heating up a primer can, I don't really want to risk it. What I'm going to do instead is use some brush-on primer. Now, theoretically, you can use any airbrush primer and just use it from a brush, but I like the Army Painter's brush-on primer because it kind of contracts as it dries. You don't need to thin this down. It works basically the same as any acrylic, but you can thin it down if you need to. Don't apply a huge amount of it, just put on a grey coat, and away we go. Make sure you're getting it into all the little nooks and crannies. And yeah, you'll see it's a nice mid-tone grey, very similar to sort of Halford car primer if you're in the UK. Now that brush-on primer will dry to a really matte, very smooth finish. It is super nice to paint on, so thoroughly recommend it, especially if you're doing 1 or 2 miniatures at a time. Honestly, if I was looking to paint an army, I would just wait for a nicer day, but in this case, yeah, cannot recommend it enough. So let's pop our fella down for a second because we need to mix up our Canadian green. So I've got Russian uniform here. I mentioned earlier that if you use the true color on a full scale thing, it's going to look too dark on a miniature. And there's a little bit of physics here. Basically, the smaller a thing is, the less light interacts with it. So once that color hits our eyes, it's not as bright as it would seem. So the smaller something is, the lighter you have to paint it, otherwise it looks too dark. Right? Crazy, but it's true. We're going to mix in Khaki, roughly 50-50. If I don't get it perfectly, I'm not too worried. If you do like how this turns out and you want to paint an army like this, just get a bottle of each of these, pop them into a larger container, shake them up, and mark it with Canadian green. And once that is thoroughly mixed together, what you'll have is a medium green, which is going to be a little bit lighter than it should as it dries, but since we're going to shade this, this will be perfect. So Canadian green, half and half, Russian uniform World War II, and Khaki. And then we'll apply this over all of the uniform. When that dries, you'll see we've got a green which looks like it's seen a little bit of time in the field. It's still clearly lighter than the Russian uniform we started with, but it's nice. That's going to work really well. Now, if you don't want to mix, what you could use instead would be Deathworld Forest from Citadel. It's a very similar color, but it has a slightly more yellow, warm tint to it. So it's not perfect, but then remember, uniform isn't. When you start getting into field conditions and how the fade and the sun and all that affects uniforms, don't worry if it's not 100% perfect. Just paint your army the same way. They'll look great on the table. We'll move on and apply some base coats to his skin. I'm going to use here Army Painter's Tanned Flesh. Now, as always, how you paint the skin is up to you, but because I'm going to do an all-over shade later on, I'm going to use this because it's a little bit lighter, slightly more rich than Bugman's Glow by comparison. Now for his webbing and his pack, we're actually going to use VALLEJO Game Color Khaki. This is a different khaki to VALLEJO Model Color, so it is important that you spot the difference. If you want here, you could use instead Iraqi Sand. It's quite similar to this. Nothing I could find suggested that Canadian troops blancoed their kit in the same way that the British did, so it would have been in the khaki color that the canvas was issued. So away we go with this. The exception to this is going to be this little respirator case on the side here, because unlike the rest of the gear, which was blancoed green by British troops, this was actually manufactured in green. Now, I'm using Death Guard green here from Citadel, mostly because I want it to stand out a little bit from the green uniform I've already painted, but you could just as easily use Russian uniform here. That would also be technically accurate. And then for the strap on his rifle, we're going to use VALLEJO Model Color Khaki. You could use game color here, it's really up to you, but again, looking for just a little bit of difference in these tones. Now that is the end of all of the soft details that we're going to be painting, so his uniform and his kit and what have you. What I've got here, this is a Luxe pencil, this is a makeup brush, makes a really good dry brush, because what we're going to do now is apply a very light dry brush of dark sand over all of the miniature. So you'll see pass over this area a few times and I'll pick up the creases in the edge of his sleeve there. And you can do this over everything. Now take your time here. If you do want to go the route of highlighting this traditionally, then what you can do is skip this step. And once you've shaded your miniature, just go back to your base colors and add a drop or two of ivory into each of them to highlight with. But this is going to be a little bit faster and gives us a nice texture to our uniform. Now right now I know that looks dreadful, but keep the faith. It's a little bit chalky and it's not quite the right color, but when we shade that, it's going to bring all of that together. We'll We'll move on now to painting in his helmet, and I've got here refractive green. And it helps here if you've got a brush you can be a little bit brutal with, especially if you're painting the helmets which have the scrim netting on them. Just jam this in there, and then when you come to the undersides, slow down a little or swap to a smaller brush. And while that dries, you can paint in his rifle and entrenching tool with a little bit of beige brown. Just go straight over the top of all of the metalwork on the rifle, because we're going to paint that next. So then for those black details and other things like his boots, what I'm going to use is German grey. This is just off black. And as I say all the time, black is actually quite uncommon in reality. We don't really see real black very often. So unless you want to play up the toy soldier aspect of what you're doing, try and stick to something which is just a little off black. At this point, there's not really much left to do. We'll add a little bit of flat earth to his water bottle here. And then for the final base coat, if he's wearing it, just a very light dry brush of khaki over the top of his helmet scrim will do the job. Now at this point, if you need to do any tidy up, you can touch up your base coats where you need to. But what we'll do now is to shade him. What I've got here, this is a little bottle I've mixed up of half and half Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium. And it's important. I would suggest no matter what shade you're using, if it's a quick shade or whatever, thin it down, roughly half and half, because we don't want this to turn super dark. As well, if you are using the new Agrax Earthshade, mixing it in with the medium, it will behave just like the old stuff. So up to you, but I'm now going to bucket this over the entire miniature. Make sure that you are working it into any recesses and gaps, and just cover the whole thing. Once it's applied, we'll leave this for about half an hour, somewhere warm if I can find it, and get a look at that. Now at last, when your shade is dried, you'll have something that looks like this. And I reckon you could put an army looking like this on the table quite happily. But as always, what we'll do is take it just a little bit further. Now skin and faces and what have you are always an easy part to really bump up your painting. So I've got here some Cadian flesh tone, and I'm going to cover over most of his skin, leaving just little bits of shaded tanned flesh in the recesses. And then if you want to take that further, just a couple of lines of Kislev flesh here and there to really accentuate some of the details of his face. Tip of his nose, his cheekbones, that sort of thing. Now I've got gunmetal. This is a VALLEJO Model Air color. But anything dark, something like Iron Warriors from Citadel will do quite well, or even VALLEJO Oily Steel. Just a little bit on the gunmetal, funnily enough, will add quite a lot to the look here. And then finally, I've got some German Camo Beige, and any middling sort of beige or brown color will do here. I'm just going to quickly flick along some of the scrim netting in the helmet, just to add a little bit more definition to this. Now once this is done, I'm going to hit him with a varnish. I'll be using Instar's Varnish Plus off of the brush, because again, I don't want to take him outside and try and do this in sub-zero temperatures. I'll finish off his base, and we'll get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished.
So there at last, our Canadian soldier is complete. And if you've watched any of my previous British painting guides, you'll notice that the method is actually quite familiar. It's really just a case of getting that green that you want to begin with. But as always, remember, between washing, field conditions, when something is wet, it gets darker, there isn't a right color. You can paint it pretty much any green you want, and as long as it's a vaguely military green, you'll be fine. As well, things like those little conversions, adding, clipping off the bayonet and what have you, it's little things like that which will make a force your own. I do suggest if you're going to add any of the shoulder flashes from decals, remember to apply those before you put your varnish on and you will be golden. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.